Hey, so yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor Huang. Thank you to the Institute. It's been an absolutely fascinating day, and one of the things that I most enjoy is the sort of interdisciplinary conversation where I feel out of my depth, and I'm very pleased about today being the most boring person in the room. So a lot of my work is with scientists, with policymakers on how we make decisions upstream about new technologies. This is my current research program. So this is a big research program in the UK that brings together computer scientists with assorted others. And we are interested in new forms of creativity, new forms of collaboration, with the hope that it produces better outcomes in and around artificial intelligence. So I'm not an AI person. I work on emerging technologies. I've worked on policies around geoengineering, nanotechnology, most recently self-driving vehicles. What I'm going to be talking about today, though, is about how we try to ground a conversation about artificial intelligence that a lot of us that are close to policy feel has got very out of hand and very hard to make sense of. And I'll try and sort of riff on what some of the others have said this morning and build on it. But as far as possible, I'll try and fit it into the frame of my work, most of which is about the area of responsible innovation. So how we connect questions of innovation, science and technology, to questions of responsibility that are intrinsically, I would argue, political. So I'm going to start with a sort of expression of responsibility, and I think it's a problematic one. So this came out, some of you will remember, a few months after the launch of ChatGPT, so 2 and a bit years ago. And it was a one-sentence open letter, that asserts that mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal scale risks such as pandemics and nuclear war. For those of us interested in a sort of democratic conversation about what AI might mean, the gap between a chatbot that had gone viral and an imagined risk, which was to one of the ending of the human race, seemed large and hard to bridge. But this wasn't an extreme set of people engaged in this. This was the very leaders of the AI universe getting involved in this. I got sufficiently interested in this imagination of the risk of a technology that I asked the BBC if I could make a short documentary, a radio documentary about this, this question of why it was that within artificial intelligence, the new masters of the universe were talking about the end of the world, right? Seeing this risk in apocalyptic terms. One of the first things I went to do in recording that documentary was to go to visit the first name on that list, who we've already seen a picture of today, Geoffrey Hinton. So Geoffrey Hinton, this was before he won a Nobel Prize and became even harder to access for a radio interview. I wanted to know, so normally when people go and see Geoffrey Hinton, what they want to know about is the sort of technical bits, right? Because he, perhaps more than anything, we've already heard, has been associated with this connectionist view of deep neural networks that has proven to be so influential. But I wanted to know why a scientist was getting involved in questions of politics in this way, why he believed what he did, which is a delicate discussion to have. And the most telling thing that he told me was not a technical explanation about, what it is about computers that would enable the eventual apocalypse, but it was a sort of political insight which suggested a lack of faith in conventional politics, a lack of faith in democratic institutions to be able to govern these things, and to be able to engage with the questions of inequality that he regarded as important, as a self-proclaimed left-wing scientist. But he said, in effect, that the one thing that would get everybody to wake up, so policymakers within countries, but also policymakers between countries, would be a risk imagined in terms that are total. This totalitarian idea of risk would be the thing that would get everybody to come together. And it was quite an interesting admission of the hidden politics of this idea of existential risk. Now, more recently, that risk has been captured by perhaps the most extreme proponent of it, Elisa Yudkowsky, in this book that is already starting to get quite a lot of coverage. And I would note here, as a policy person, the concern for me is not, are they right or wrong, right? I mean, if you push me, I would say they're wrong, but that's not the point. It's the intentional ignorance of current technology as a way to leapfrog to future discussions. So they write in the introduction of this book that they are explicitly not interested in the AI that we have around us at the moment. They are interested in some future imaginary technology, which has particular regulatory implications and is particularly convenient for people making, building, and looking to cut regulations for those technologies that we have at the moment. The idea within science is a very old one. It's not just some particular group of people obsessed with existential risk, right? It goes right back to the roots of computer science. So we've just had a meeting in London a couple of weeks ago that celebrated the 75th anniversary of the Turing test that we were talking about earlier. The Turing test, published in 1950 in the Imitation Game paper. A year later, Alan Turing gave this lecture in which he talks in explicitly extreme and existential terms about what has come to be known as the control problem within AI, and he relates it to a familiar piece of science fiction, perhaps one of the earliest, Error One by Samuel Butler. Fast forward to the launch of ChatGPT again. This is Sam Altman, soon after the release of ChatGPT, doing his world tour. And as part of that, his stop-off in Britain was at my university, at University College London. Sam Altman, I mean, what was initially surprising about so many of these sort of conversations that Sam Altman involved himself in was how extremely badly done the interviews were. There was no real scrutiny of why he wanted to do what he wanted to do. But when pushed, it was interesting, asking, well, what are the benefits of your technology? What is all of this for? That rather than say, oh, chatbots are useful for this, and you can do these things at the moment, the leapfrogging that he's engaged in here is to say, well, in the future, what we're doing, the project is to create something called AGI, figure out how to make it safe, and there's another debate to be had about so-called safety. Safe has a very particular meaning in this debate, and then figure out the benefits. So a refusal to be held to account on matters of benefits and purposes. AGI, artificial general intelligence, is now everywhere. I don't know if any of you have walked past this. I took this photo 2 days ago. just outside, just round the corner from here by the Foundation Model building. AGI has become a sort of placeholder for a set of imagined futures, right? And scientists and others, as this term has been taken on, have tried to give it some sort of scientific credibility, a lot of which harks back to the early history of artificial intelligence research. This paper came out, I think, yesterday. And this paper, some of you may recognize the group of people involved here, who are not all industry insiders. They're not all pushing the same story. We have some public critics in there, like Gary Marcus, for example. So it can be read more as an act of consensus building, an attempt to build consensus about what might count as AGI. The aim of this paper is actually to build benchmarks for our journey towards something that we might regard as artificial general intelligence. Why do I have a problem with this? Well, let me get on to that at the moment. The story of artificial general intelligence has taken over as a sort of twin to the question of existential risk, an imagined utopian set of benefits to go alongside these dystopian risks. It's, again, so I try, I'm not a computer scientist myself, so I try not to assess the plausibility of these claims. Instead, what I'm trying to do is analyze the politics of these claims. So in imagining something called artificial general intelligence, what might we be missing? And these are just, I mean, trying to sort of give voice to some of my slightly instinctive attitudes to this narrative. I'd just put it at this, is that it seems like a sort of false teleology that asked why these people are doing what they're doing. AGI is clearly not the reason why Sam Altman is doing what he's doing, and it's clearly not the reason why billions are now being thrown at the technology. Sorry, trillions. I should update that. And then in practical terms, in policy making, it I think has all sorts of implications for how we think about the governance of this technology. I've listed them, and maybe we can come back to them in the Q&A. What AGI does, perhaps more than anything, is give a story of inevitability. Inevitability, technological determinism are the sorts of things that perhaps upset science and technology studies scholars like myself more than anything else. And like so much about artificial intelligence, most of what needs to be said was said 50 years ago by Joseph Weizenbaum, who, again, we've already heard about and heard from, who was known as a sort of technological curmudgeon in his day, but makes, as well as some very important critical points about the technology that he was involved in, and indeed the technologies that he was instrumental in building, as we heard from Nick, also made some very important points about the politics of technology in general, and the relationship between this story of inevitability and one of responsibility, right? It is, in effect, a way of researchers to offload responsibility. How does this story of inevitability play out in very real terms? Maybe we'll hear more about this tomorrow from James when he digs more into the sort of political economy of AI, but this is becoming real. It's becoming real, this story, in material terms. So in material terms, in the data centers that AI companies are building themselves and are committing the American government to building, and in the patterns of investment that as I said, are now in the order of trillions, where we have the rapid, I mean very rapid emergence of systems of such Byzantine complexity that they now look already too big to fail, right? So when we think about the possible deflation of an AI bubble in the United States, there is a lot of money at stake here. And it's a lot of money that is tied up in some very complicated ways. I realize the title on this slide is almost impossible for anybody to pass. Hands up if anybody gets that reference. Okay, good. Right, I need to rethink my titles. The reference is to a story that I regard as a very important parable of responsible innovation. Add to your reading list the story of The Lorax by Dr. Seuss. That is where the line "figuring on biggering" comes from, but I won't be using that one again. Okay. So what's going on here appears to be something more profound than old models of regulatory capture in which industries are able to inveigle themselves into governance structures so that those governance structures reflect their interests. There's something perhaps more important going on, even if the actual lobbying behind it looks a little bit different. And it's an idea that comes from this book. So this book has just come out, and it's actually about climate politics. The idea here is that real innovative success comes not from regulatory capture, but from capturing the imagination, controlling the story, controlling the narrative, such that your future becomes one that is seen as inevitable. When it comes to artificial intelligence, a lot of that story plays out in terms that we might call AI exceptionalism. The idea that artificial intelligence is different from every other technology, and therefore lessons that we have learned about previous technologies no longer apply. I think this piece by two computer scientists from Princeton, I think, is a really useful rejoinder to that story. It asks, in effect, rather than treating AI in this AGI superintelligence sort of mode, what if we reject that story, the story that the industry are so keen to tell us, and instead think about it as a normal technology? And I want to do some of that this afternoon. I want to go to some of those ideas. I want to go back to some of my favorite STS thinkers to start to think about what normal AI might mean and how we might improve a debate about normal AI. So this is Bruno Latour. Bruno Latour died relatively recently, a hero of science and technology studies. Many of you will have read him. He has this nice idea about attachments, right? This idea that the story that we tell about innovation being one of emancipation from complexity, the reality of innovation being one of entanglement. It's about getting tangled up in these attachments that innovators have incentives to deny. And I originally started engaging with these ideas through my work on self-driving vehicles, which, even though they're sold as autonomous vehicles, are intensely attached to their local environments, to local contexts, to particular identified needs. If we engage with AI as a normal technology, one of the things that we can see about it is that it is radically unfinished. And AI people would even admit this, that it is sort of up to society in a way to make sense of this thing. A chatbot dropped into the world as a form of social experiment without orders about what this thing will do, how it will benefit you, or what its risks are, other than in extreme sort of amorphous ways. So it is up to us to make the most of this technology, according to that story, which is a very familiar idea in science and technology studies, because we know that technologies are developed in society. They're not just made and then given to society. It also poses an important challenge to policymakers, which is to demonstrate, to assure that those technologies work, and to help society know what is good AI and what is bad AI. And the example that I often use is with a new medicine. You know, if you take something like a COVID vaccine, it was notable that the COVID vaccine was developed in a period of about 2 weeks in the place. So, you know, most of the COVID vaccines had this pattern. They were developed very, very quickly, but that's not what takes the time when it comes to a vaccine. What takes the time is showing that the thing is beneficial, showing that the thing is safe. That's what also takes the money. And we forget that the job of innovation with a new medicine happens in clinical trials, in effect, in a form of societal laboratory. You know, creating the vaccine in itself is job one, not job done. And we can see, I mean, there are some clinical trials for artificial intelligence being done at the moment, but they are not many. And it's the sort of thing that really worries AI developers when you say to them, where are the clinical trials? Where's the independent evidence that this thing works? And again, that idea is not new. That idea, you know, Joe Weizenbaum was writing about that stuff in the 1970s. Here is a normal technology, and I think it's a nice artifact to think with. So this is in the Science Museum in London. Anybody know what this is? What is it? Go on. It's really testing the car people. This is a Model T Ford, right? A Model T Ford, absolutely iconic motor car. Why is it iconic? Well, not because it was the first, not because it was the best, but it was cheap enough to open up automotion to the masses. First decade of the 20th century, the Model T Ford did perhaps more than anything to enable the expansion of this technology to middle-class families. And set in train a set of disruptions, but also forced society to confront a set of transitions. You can see down at the bottom there, that graph you can just about make out. So with the release of the Model T Ford, we're basically on the flat bit of that curve. I have got a laser pointer, but now I feel like a scientist. You can see after the release of the Model T Ford, the number of vehicles in the United States skyrocketing over the first half of the 20th century. That's the Great Depression there. What's happening in the top is a famous early film from San Francisco just before the major earthquake damaged quite large chunks of the city. And what you can see there is a mixed economy of road traffic. You can see, in effect, competing transport modes, all sharing space in a chaotic and frankly terrifying way. And you can also see, so that is the new technology on the block, the motor car just there. And what happened soon afterwards was a set of policy decisions in many American cities that radically transformed American cities in favor of this new mode of technology. So public transport was radically reduced or rationalized. Pedestrians were, we were talking about this, a few of us, a couple of days ago, pedestrians were domesticated away from the streets and told to use sidewalks and pedestrian crossings. It's also a reminder, though, that roads are still, to an extent, shared spaces. It's a video that I quite often show people working on self-driving cars, just to spook them. And I like to remind them that even though they talk about a transition to a fully self-driving future, I remind them that we still have horses on the streets of London, right? Now, back in the first decade of the 20th century, policymakers sought to assess, well, what are the risks of this new technology? The British government set up a royal commission on the motor car to try to, in effect, do a risk assessment. What might these, at a time when almost nobody in this country used cars, but when it was a sensible assessment that these things would prove popular and could prove transformational. This example is used by a very important technology policy writer called David Collingridge, who notes with some laughter that the cleverest people of the day in 1908, when this Royal Commission finally reported, right, on the eve of the production of the Model T, they noted that there was one big risk that came from motor cars. And that risk was that they kicked up a lot of dust. Right? That was the big problem that was identified. Asked to do a risk assessment, that's what the experts told us. Their naivety was, in effect, a failure to engage with the possibilities of transformation that come from recognizing the attachments of a particular technological object. Some of you might recognize this. I took this at the exhibition yesterday. And the obvious attachment that the car has that maybe has had the most profound implications for future society is the road. And it's roads that have enabled the car to function, that have enabled the car's benefits, but have also maybe done so much to change lifestyles, livelihoods, and if you're a planner or an architect, actual places. But it's also roads that allow us to imagine alternatives. And we can imagine alternative design criteria for these things. So these are two roads in London. The first one is outside my university, up here. This is Euston Road, and it's a classic example of sort of what we might call safe space for each of the individual car users. So we have buses, cycles, pedestrians, all in effect penned off, stay in your lane, that's how we keep you safe, and that's how we keep the cars moving fast. Down here is more of an experiment in shared space. So some of you might know the Dutch roots of the ideal of shared space. Much contested, but this is an example in which the lanes that separate off different modes have been deliberately blurred. And I don't put these up to say which one is better or worse, but just to say that there are alternative ways of arranging these various transport modes, alternative conceptions of safety, alternative ideas about who might benefit. The playing out of the normal technology of the car over the course of now more than a century has been a case of making sense of these attachments. In risk terms, the very obvious risk that we present and the risk that is often mentioned by people in favor of self-driving cars is a cataclysmic health risk, right? A technology with a death toll of more than 1 million people every year would seem to be a cataclysm, except that in most societies we would suggest that the benefits of this technology are also substantial, and also we would suggest that unless you're in the United States, we can do something about the risks of motor cars. Most rich countries in the world are getting safer on the whole. The United States, depressingly, is not when it comes to motor cars. Within artificial intelligence, then, to go back to AI, we might think about what some of the risks that are imagined in this more normal sense might be. So this is a paper that actually came out from some researchers at DeepMind, Google's AI lab in London. looking at what have come to be known as socio-technical risks, which I would regard as actual risks from artificial intelligence, right? And you can see there a really interesting set of dimensions and a set of imagined threat models, they would sometimes say, across various different categories. Some of these are downstream implications, some of them are upstream questions of how AI is being built, the provenance of its data, the energy consumption that goes into training these models and running inference on them, right? So this is quite an interesting set of alternatives, I would argue. And I think this offers us the potential for real engagement with governance. I won't engage with Kamala Harris, but she did make an important point. The second point I'll just make about AI before getting into some results from a recent survey that we ran is that I think it's really important to engage with most people's experience of AI systems, in particular generative AI systems. It was telling, for example, that last year's word of the year in Britain was the word brain rot, which has already sort of been replaced by the word slop as a useful parlance for talking about AI-generated stuff, and with it a set of assumptions about, carelessness about questions of provenance, questions of watermarking, questions of any sort of ground truth. This video, you might remember, was famously shared by Donald Trump, and since, just in the last couple of weeks, we have seen the proliferation of these AI-generated videos thanks to OpenAI's newest version of their system. So for many people, that is the reality of generative AI. Working out what exactly the risks are here is not at all straightforward. We shouldn't make the mistake that the experts made with the motor car and say, oh, well, this will definitely undermine elections. We might be able to say that with some confidence as a thing to worry about and a thing to watch for. We don't know, except to say that millions of examples of this stuff in the real world are already people's experience. So one of the things that I do a lot of is try to understand what the public actually think about new technologies. I also try a lot to understand what experts actually think, in particular what experts think about what the public thinks. And I'm just going to finish by presenting some data from some surveys that we've done. The first is from a public survey asking people a range of questions about artificial intelligence. What this tells you, so I'm not going to give any more findings other than this one, but just to represent the sort of appetite for regulation, right? And this is, I think, a very important thing for governments to wake up to, is that people are very keen for these technologies to be regulated in a way that feels independent. What we did so my team and I, is take some of those public findings about what the public think about artificial intelligence and then flip them back onto artificial intelligence researchers. So we asked AI researchers what they think about some of these same issues. We think it's the biggest survey ever done of AI researchers. Sorry, a sudden white slide blinds the audience. I'm afraid it's white from here on in, so put on your sunglasses. And you can see, so we had a pretty massive sample. So a social scientist like myself, I normally work in N's of about 50. Right? Most of my work is qualitative. Suddenly I've got an N of 4,000, and I'm pretty excited by that. We have pretty good representation across most of the places where most of the AI research is taking place. Some unsurprising findings here. We asked, do you think the risks are greater than the benefits of AI. So the green bar there is more risk than benefit. And understandably, most AI researchers think that they are, right? Although a substantial amount of ambivalence, the blue bit in both cases. We had a survey of imagined benefits of the technology from a public survey. And it was quite interesting. You note a lot of divergence on the benefits, right? What you can see is that, sorry, I've missed off the key bit of information here, which is that the light green bit is the public, the dark green bit is the AI researchers. The public are much less certain. The AI researchers are much more convinced, and also they rank the benefits differently from ordinary people. So ordinary people are imagining benefits to, for example, shopping, right? They can sort of see that. The AI researchers are much more enthusiastic about learning and education. Interestingly, though, when you ask about risks, what you see is a substantial amount of agreement. So the experts and the public seemingly agree much more when it comes to the risks of artificial intelligence. So here again we have the light green being the public, the dark green being the AI researchers. Sorry, I should stop calling them experts, because one of the things that STS people do is trouble the word expert. There's also a degree of what we might call technological determinism within the AI research community. So just over half of the AI researchers surveyed here think that AGI is inevitable, right? Which suggests that they think that it's also a meaningful category. We'll come in a second to why that's interesting. We also see an understanding of the public that some of us in STS would call a deficit model. The deficit model being the idea that a lack of public trust in science or technology is explained by public ignorance of that science and technology. That, if you like, more knowledge will lead to more trust, more support for science and technology. And we can see a strong set of agreeers with that, but not universal, and a strong sense also among AI researchers that they are the best people to understand the risks of AI, right? Not people who might be affected by AI. So strong sort of vibes of technocracy, strong vibes of technological determinism. A sense that it's more democratically important to involve people in the impacts of AI than in any questions about how it should be developed, how it should be trained, that sort of thing. A suggestion, in effect, that democracy has a place downstream, not upstream. And some interestingly different answers about questions of accountability and liability. So we asked them, which is a potentially very radical statement to agree with. The people who create AI systems should be held responsible for the real-world impacts of those systems, right? This was at the time that Oppenheimer was in cinemas, right? A very old and important question of responsible innovation. And a surprising number of AI researchers express a desire to imagine responsibilities in those ways. Interestingly, so we separated on the benefits and risks question two groups out, pessimists and optimists. The pessimists are much, much more keen for this view of responsibility to play out in the world. Next one, and I think this is, again, this was important because this was a hugely important policy debate at the time. The question of changing copyright law in order to favor AI companies, in order to free them to be able to train on whatever data they come across. And what we saw was a really surprising degree of agreement between the public and between AI researchers on the need to care more, in effect, about training data. So this is not at all a sort of free-for-all where the AI researchers say, let us have everything, give it, right? Which is, if you like, the position that is put forward by some of the leading AI companies. And then just a final set of findings before I finish. So one other thing that we did in this survey is that we asked people in their own terms, so this is AI researchers, we're asking them in their own terms, what one thing worries you most about artificial intelligence? And then we categorized their responses in various ways. The first insight from this is that computer scientists are very bad at counting up to one, right? Almost all of them put more than one thing, but that's fine. We have multiple codes for things. What you can see, just to go back to the existential risk thing, that comes in pretty low down the list at sort of 3% of people. Adjacent ideas that will be familiar to some of you to do with alignment and control, again, only 4% of people. People are much more concerned about real-world uses, misuses, the misinformation, jobs, that sort of stuff, than they are about this existential risk question. And we were also able to run some correlations on those things. So, STS has a long history of being interested in gender and innovation questions. Really interesting applying a gender demographic correlation to this, and you find that women researchers, of whom there are not many in our sample, so less than a quarter of our sample are women, but they're more than twice as likely to worry about bias as men. And the people who answered yes to that is AGI inevitable question are much more likely to worry about existential risk in those sort of modes, which suggests that there's a sort of coherent story there. Okay, why is it worth doing this? Final point. It's worth doing this because I think we urgently need to improve the debate about artificial intelligence and its governance. There is this idea, and I think it's an idea that I hold on to, that science and scientists can act as the conscience of technology, which is an idea that originally comes from a guy called Harvey Brooks, and that the diversity that we see within our survey is a source of enrichment for a more productive debate on artificial intelligence. The messages that I think we can take from it are pretty simple ones. When you see hype, we absolutely shouldn't believe it, nor should we believe that it's what most people in the world of AI believe. Alan Turing, yes, I agree, a hero of computer science, but has done enormous damage to a debate about AI policy by cementing this idea that AI is actually about intelligence rather than about something else. Regulation should not wait and see, which the existential risk narrative asks us to do. Regulation should look for early warnings and seek to steer the technology in better ways at an early point, recognizing that a lot of what needs to happen, as I mentioned earlier, isn't just within the gift of AI companies. And we should urgently look at diversity. The fact that we hear from the same voices over and over and over again in the AI debate and hold those people as gurus, not just interested parties, is perhaps our biggest problem. I will finish there. Hopefully I've got a few minutes for questions. Thank you.
感谢杰克·斯蒂尔格教授的精彩分享。现在我们进入问答环节。如果各位观众有任何问题，请举手示意，工作人员会将麦克风递给您。谢谢。
Hi, Professor Stilgoe. I think your presentation have given me more comprehensive understanding of the responsible technology. My question is, since the connection between AI research and commercialization have become increasingly close, from your research perspective, what's the difference between AI product managers and AI scientists in their understanding of responsible AI, especially regarding the applications they themselves would undertake? And as the pioneers in the field of large model like OpenAI have also begun to develop ambitious applications like Sora, may I ask what factors you think can make these AI product managers better adhere the concept of responsible AI in the future?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Really interesting, really, really interesting question. So let me step back and do another idea from science and technology studies that I find really useful. And it's an idea originally from a sociologist of technology called Donald Mackenzie. He had this idea, what he called the certainty trough. He said, often it's the people at one stage removed from a research area who are the most certain about a technology. And that actually, if you speak to the people working on it, the people aware of its contingencies, they are the people who are most uncertain. So one of the things we wanted to do with this survey was engage with the researchers in order to bring out some of that uncertainty. Because what we hear from the AI leaders is a huge amount of certainty, and it's been very effective certainty, very persuasive certainty, but it clearly doesn't reveal any of the sort of contingencies that we would regard as important. In terms of what that means then for AI researchers and AI product managers, and whether people who maybe entered into the field as AI researchers now find themselves doing something more like product management, and I think that shift has happened, and it's happened very quickly. It also engages with a really important debate about responsibility and about how responsibility is imagined differently by engineers and scientists historically, because those, they have different histories. Computer science has its own cultures of responsibility that play into this as well. I actually have a PhD student at the moment who's just been doing some work with AI product managers within companies, trying to ask them these questions of responsibility. And one of the things that she has found is a real degree of anxiety, a real degree of ambivalence about the work that they are involved in. And I think to extrapolate some of her work, some of what I would say about that is that they feel like their roles have changed quicker than they've been able to comprehend. And I think a lot of them have found themselves in the mode of product management, whereas they maybe entered as people, computer scientists either developing models or people interested in assessing these models. And I think if you compared it to something like the motor car, right, there is a difference in speed there. The motor car, we did have decades in order to understand what this thing meant, decades in order to understand what it meant to make these things safer, the difference between product development and product assessment and all the rest of it. But it's a really important dividing line. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the talk, and continue the motor car reference. Well, the tragic death of Senna, of course, changed the FIA just like retroactively changed the safety measures, the helmet, the neck rest, and everything. And what kind of signs do you think would similarly function as this like dramatic or catastrophic event for policymaking entities if there is this possibility of such a sign, or is it precisely the hard part of it that is so permissive in our society that we cannot really pick out a sign of the kind of incoming, acropolis in a way?
Really good, right. So yeah, there's this idea, and it's sometimes referred to by aircraft engineers. They call it tombstone governance, right? Which is the idea that regulations change when people die. And almost we should give up on attempts to change regulation in the face of those very clear moments of societal awakening. I originally got into working on self-driving vehicles because of some very high-profile deaths, and have been really surprised at how little awakening has happened around that. In the way as, you know, the analogy with Formula One does not seem to be playing out when it comes to self-driving vehicles. With generative AI, I think it's really interesting to think through what the early warnings have been, or what the early warnings might be. So the sorts of things that I see having slightly woken some people up out of their somnambulance have been things like prominent owners of copyright offering an objection to large language models. You know, it was really notable that in Britain, the presumption that, oh, well, copyright law will have to change in order to suit the AI companies was changed. You know, that mood changed when people like Elton John kicked up a fuss. With more recently, more tragically, we've seen some stories about teenage suicides and emotional attachment. They're sort of, you know, again, we were hearing some about that this morning. The coming to terms with these parasocial relationships that people might have with chatbots and what that might mean, and the inadequacy of any regulation either within the system or around the system for dealing with some of that. You know, how all of those things are also, as is the way in the US, being tied up in court cases. So how those court cases play out might prove consequential. But I do wonder. I think we need to do some scenario work to work out, well, what might those early warnings look like? What sort of things might we be wanting to look for in order to tune our governance a bit better?
Thank you, Professor. And I like your ideas of doing clinical trials to AI. So my question is, like, in terms of self-driving cars, we can have like road test, so we can see if it's really safe or it's workable or not. Like we have some tests in Beijing, Yizhuang, or in Wuhan. But in terms of AI, like compared with the more tangible technologies as self-driving cars, I think it seems to me that it's very hard to prevent people from using AI because it's so easily used and so easy to spread and without any cost or with very cheap cost. So I want to ask, in this situation, in what ways or what social experiments can we do to really test the responsibility of AI? Thank you.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, the first thing I would say is to appreciate, you know, I think the language of social experimentation is very useful language for us to try to understand what might be at stake here. I mean, we should remember that with new medicines, after a series of public outrages, we now have the clinical trials apparatus that we have, right? We have had disastrous and awful and unethical experiments done on people without a clear public recognition of what's at stake, either ethically or in terms of the risks to their health. With AI, it's been notable that there's been very little conversation about what's at stake with the release of these models, right? So and that, I would say, is because of particular traditions of software, for example, in which software is released as an experimental project, explicitly experimental, and where the designers of software would say, well, the only way we know if it works is by testing it on everybody all at once. Right? It's just a different model. And because ultimately the realization was, well, if we release Windows and it's a bit buggy and your computer crashes, you restart your computer. That becomes a rather different thing if your car crashes and you're in it, or if your car crashes into somebody else, right? So what's at stake in those discussions is very different. So the discussion about self-driving vehicles and testing them, I mean, I did a few years ago, a few philosophers were making the argument about clinical trials for self-driving cars, and I said supportive things about them. And it was called the dumbest idea anybody's ever had, right? Because by some techno-libertarians who said, well, it will just slow down how quickly these things get out onto our streets. I mean, what we have seen de facto are forms of clinical trials, but they are forms of clinical trials where all of the governance is happening within companies, certainly within the US, slightly different in China. China's a really interesting example, a different governance model might be emerging. The big dividing line, I think, is about independent assessment. So an important early requirement of a clinical trial is that for it to be credible, for it to be trustworthy, the evidence was developed not by the company that are developing the technology, right? There needed to be independent assessments of these things happening. What we see with AI is very little of that sort of consideration. A lot of reliance upon, for example, companies' own internal safety testing, and then releasing what they call safety cards, just say, oh, we've, run some of these risks and we've convinced ourselves that actually this is probably fine. Right? What we haven't seen is any real independent testing. I think we are slowly building the apparatus for that independent testing. The criticism of we shouldn't let companies mark their own homework. But that apparatus still is, tiny compared to the apparatus that is developing these models and releasing them in a sort of permissionless way into the world.
Jack, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. And there was one thing I was wondering, because you talk about a trial test, like clinical tests, but what if, the technology, information technology, once it's put into massive use, and it becomes intelligent, programmable, and as more and more people participated in the use of the technology, interact with the technology evolve and change, and there's no way, the nature of the technology decides there's no way to test it. So you can only do a post-hoc audit, not necessarily independent, considering the fact that some of the basic digital infrastructures are developed in the collaboration between the government, the military, and the big platform companies. And independent auditing is, I think it's a problem in China. It's a different situation. But yeah, but on the other side, the inherent nature of the technology decides there's no prior clinical test.
Yeah. It's a really interesting challenge. So my starting point is to look for similarities with other technologies and how we govern them. But I think doing that in a well-informed way means engaging with the particularities of that technology. And I think your challenge is exactly the right one, right? Which is that maybe anything that we learn about a technology before its release would be, in effect, meaningless. Because it is only through the massive use and subsequent development of these technologies that change in use that we learn about what they mean. And I think there is, that would also be the challenge back to those people that were assessing the risks of a car, right? The risks of a car are profoundly, according to that argument, unknowable until you have, if you have 100 cars in your country, you're not going to know very much about what a car means. When you have millions of cars in your country and you've re-engineered the world around the car, you suddenly know some things.
Excuse me, but still for a car, you can test its robustness in a crash test, right?
Some things.
Yeah, you can test the resilience, robustness of a software system in an extreme test, but then, yeah, you're right. The validity of the finding for these assessments is problematic if you put a real car into the real situation.
Yeah. And there is, therefore, an argument for adaptive governance, an argument for, I would say, acting on these early warnings and looking for these early warnings. Remember that crash tests for cars also came very late, right? After they had killed not just an awful lot of their own drivers, but an awful lot of children. And it was actually, interestingly, with cars, so to go back to this question of tombstone governance, the politics of risk to children that became the lever for political action. And I think we're already seeing with AI that children might be the way that interventions in governance can be justified. Certainly in the UK, that's been the case.
感谢教授的分享，谢谢。
Thank you very much.